可以，So, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great me to welcome you to this section of cultivating and Australasian spirit languages and endangerment. I'm Hong from National China University, Taiwan, and I'm going to chair this session. For me, this session is very important because we know there are more than 7,000 languages in the world today, but half of them are endangered according to ethnology. So this session we have four important presentation here. The issues include standardization, language use, and attitudes, and language coverage. So each presenter will have 20 minutes plus 10 minutes for Q&A. So the first paper, this section will be presented by Kevin Becher, and his topic is standardization in terms of language attrition among the Atayalic community and Australasian language in Taiwan. So let's welcome.
I tend to have a strong urge to digress when I speak freely, so I hope I ask you to apologize if I read off of my notes here. So this talk is evidently at least part sociolinguistic in nature. So I'm not presenting any novel data or presenting a new reconstruction, but I hope this talk will have some methodological implications for people who do work in those areas. I was hoping for more people in historical linguistics doing Atayalic reconstruction and for Wilson to attend this talk, but maybe you can watch it later. All right. Although this talk is concerned with Atayalic languages, I should mention here that some of the processes I'm describing can be observed in other Formosan speech communities as well, in more or less advanced levels. So Atayalic and Blast's model of Austronesian, of the Austronesian language family forms a primary branch of Austronesian. Atayalic is spoken in this part of Taiwan here, but its historical center and today's area of greatest diversity is exactly where the cursor stopped it. And Renaisiang, which is also the area within Atayalic I'm most familiar with, and today's talk is primarily concerned with that. So the various varieties of Atayalic are grouped into two separate languages, Atayal and Seedek, each of which, especially the former, Atayal, shows considerable internal dialectal variation. So how are these languages faring nowadays? Generally speaking, tribe members above 50 or 60 can converse freely in their ancestral language. People younger than that, below 50, have various degrees of language comprehension, but usually cannot converse freely. However, there is heritage language education in Taiwan now, not only for indigenous kids, but for all kids in Taiwan, at least in elementary school. But sadly, the success of that heritage language education has been no better than English education in Taiwan that is fairly limited. Now, directly concerning the topic of this talk, the majority of the speech community uses a sound system that shows clear signs of phonological and to a smaller extent morphosyntactic attrition vis-a-vis older language materials and the very eldest community members. One of the reasons I decided to talk about this topic is because I was challenged at last year's SEALs when I presented on foreign language influence on Formosan languages, and when the authenticity of my language data, or worse, the proficiency of my language consultants and teachers was put into question. But also, I've noticed that different Atayalic communities take different stances towards standardization, and so I tried to understand the reasoning behind those different approaches. At this point, perhaps I should provide a little background about myself to prove my credentials, so to speak. My interests as a linguist lie in syntactic typology, historical linguistics, and more broadly language documentation, but also Nelsusundrama, Pusinchikong, Mak Basbatsu Chiga Getnai Daral, Mokatindralong Bulangawan Uri Chiga Patas Nagda. Waralhari Maspating Karalan la ka Sumbabatsu Chigenai Daral la Chika Kaalang Uri. Waral so makit paran burating lo makakit chika saing ke ka utuk moromin. Kaneka yan mong pintasan kora ka simbabaan mo lo nilsurum mo yung mo chika atas paspa na tsatsil lu rumotso sombaleci ka patas na gaarusuri. Wal mugalon ka tsungkaw chi renchan chi kukara lu netsu sundramachi ka kauchi mitsur. Kanika pasarin so paspa chi ka ketna itaral kukara lu tukla. Here are some pictures of downtown Chennai, the only home of the Itaral speech community nowadays. So given my intentions and connections to the community, I've had, oh, sorry, I forget that I have to switch twice. I'll show you the picture again. Let me do it here because it's easier. Okay. All right, here. This here's some pictures of downtown Chennai, the only home of the Itaral community, speech community. Given my intentions and connections to the community, I've had quite a bit of exposure to the languages of Renaissance over the years. In addition to the major dictionaries widely available in English, I've looked at various locally printed glossaries and vocabularies, such as you can see here at the top of the slide, teaching materials, Bibles, signages, and whatnot. I've also attended quite a few meetings with elders and educators dedicated to different areas of lexicography and documentation. On the right-hand side of this slide here, you can see just 2 meetings I attended last year. The top one was in Chennai village with local Itaral as well as Truku elders discussing place names of the area as well as some related vocabulary. The bottom one was in Puli with the Gadaya elders and educators. That's what the meeting was about. Right. So it doesn't take a lot of exposure to Atayalic to recognize certain inconsistencies in speech and writing, which are presented on this slide and which I'll go over in some detail in just a minute. You'll see that these mostly represent the phonological erosion of the syllable coda, leading to a bunch of mergers. Finals are often retrievable through internal reconstruction by means of morphological alternation, so when you add suffixes to the stems, but not all roots can be subject to suffixation. All right, and so in some cases, in other cases, but also not always, original finals can be identified through comparison with related languages. The problem here being that Atayalic being lexically very divergent from other, for most, or like Austronesian language. So one common process that you can see is that final L and R are pronounced as N and merges with it. So for example, the word for one, kingan, is often pronounced as kingan. The most common way you hear the word for Atayal pronounced by most speakers is Tayan, as opposed to more conservative Tayal and even more conservative Tayal, from which the English is derived, right? And then there's L and R being used interchangeably elsewhere, especially in intervocalic positions. So, for example, the word for B and for neck are Waru and Waru respectively, but most pronounce them as Waru nowadays. I've also seen the word good, Maru, pronounced or heard as Maru. Then the final M is pronounced as an N in Renaissance by default. So traditionally the word for dark in the home is pronounced as home, or it's home. And then generally there's variation of the velar and differential fricatives. So for example, I've seen and heard both Nagaha and Nagaka in Sadek, and similar things with Itara. I asked the speakers, which one it should be, which one we should write, and then they go back and forth. So it's not even just that they say, I don't know, but they'll say one definitely, and the next time I ask them, they say, oh no, the other one. So you see the same sort of similar alternation with a lot of words. So it was important to notice that some words are consistently only used one, but there's variation in many words as well. So for example, nak and nak. Meaning only. Then there's inconsistency in the representation of vowel stops. So for example, in Itaral, to plant something is pamuhilon, but also pamuhilon, same thing. And then, as I said, we're similar with the Tayal is the word for child. Latte is most often pronounced as latte nowadays. All right. So then, of course, this raises the following 2 questions. First, are these alternations indicative of Chinese influence? Perhaps so, as all the changes move exactly towards a Chinese phonology. However, other phonotactic combinations not allowed in Chinese are also conserved in Atayalic. So, for example, final S or final S. So it's not like the resulting phonotactics just match Chinese exactly. The neutralizations in coda position with alternating consonants across paradigms. We have an example here, yeah, but it's difficult to explain. So here you see that this N is actually underlying the N. This gets deleted. It's a little bit complicated, but you see those alternations across paradigms. So this is not a new phenomenon in Atayalic languages, because other mergers have been firmly established in the language family. So, for example, well, at least in Janaicia. So, for example, final P has merged in that position with K, and final G is usually enunciated as a labial glide. So for example, the word for to rest in Itaral is mahmu, but if you use the locative form of that, it's bahnagan, where you can see the G underlyingly showing up. There's other examples, but let's. The next question here then is: are these alternations indicative of linguistic attrition? That is a process of decreasing proficiency in the language, shifting toward another language. In this case, Mandarin. Usually, attrition is detected in comparison to an established standard or a speech community, as in heritage communities that move elsewhere. But in this case, the entire speech community is shifting, which in essence is how sound change happens regularly, right? So, but can the mergers, or and by mergers I mean the people who merge, actually be considered fully functional native speakers, or are the mergers, referring to the process, evidence of incomplete language acquisition? Let us return to this question in just a couple of minutes. So now it's worth looking at the previous literature on these languages and to try and establish around what time those mergers were first recorded. I keep forgetting. Okay, thank you. First two early descriptions of the Atayalic. Homer notes in 1996 that some of the mergers that lead to paradigmatic alternations had already been firmly established. So these here, I won't read them out, right? And then in addition, he notes that the younger speakers merge L and R with N in final position, what I just mentioned before, adding that this change is common across Atayalic in general. Earlier, yet in field work that must have been conducted in the 1940s, Asai already notes that syllable final L is often produced as a sound resembling N or T. Now, I've heard Asai being criticized for not representing all the phonemic distinctions consistently, but my impression is that he clearly perceived the phonetic differences. He does indeed describe them in detail in his paper, but that the alternations described in his publication, I believe, are truly representative of the speech at the time. So those alternations are between, again, X and H, and between K and Q. Now, turning quickly to some earlier scholarly sources, Rao, in her 1992 dissertation, notes that underlying L is regularly pronounced as N in the word final position. This is not in Janaicia, but in Ulai, close to Taipei, actually, but the same thing. Not mentioning any age-related differences. So it's not just the younger folks or something generally. The final M, however, remains intact in her data, in contrast to what I presented you in Janaicia. Earlier in data collected in the 1960s, Egerov does not mention any coda mergers, but some do appear, like, for example, the word for frog, patong, in Sedek ends in an R, and so something funky going on there. He mentions some other phonological simplifications in colloquial style. For example, tunuk as a simplification of tunuk to refer to rock or stone. But this is a different process from what I'm describing here. And then also the initial glottal stopper is recorded for the word atayal, but only optionally. He also has tayal. While alaqi, the word for child that I mentioned before, only appears as laqi without the initial glottal stop. So next, it's also useful to look at some evidence of mergers beyond the modern Atayalic varieties. First, it's noteworthy that the neighboring Kakabu language shows some of the same mergers. So L to N in final position, R being pronounced as L, and variation of X and H. Furthermore, at least the confusion between K and Q appears to be an older issue than just language evolution over the past century or so. And there's additional alternation between Q and the glottal stop. So you can see here the word for person, Oleg and Dek must be related to each other, but you can see that one has a medial Q and the other one a medial glottal stop, and it's not obvious which one would be the original. And you see the word for woman having an initial K and Oleg, but Q and Sedek consistently. And the word for to see, which of course reconstructs to cross-genation with a K. It shows up with a Q and Siddiq, but on the other hand, the word for to eat has K in Siddiq, but it has a Q in Siddiq. So sometimes Siddiq is the one that innovates, and sometimes it's Siddiq could go anyway, and there doesn't seem to be a clear phonological condition. There's also some evidence of an older type of coda erosion in the form of a seemingly sporadic loss of final L here at the bottom, but since that's not directly related to the other processes that I'm describing, I'll skip over this in the interest of time. So it's not like if we just look behind the horizon of Chinese interference, the skies clear up and we find ourselves in neo-grammarian Disney. Okay? So there's been these alternations for quite a while. Now back to the question, if the inconsistencies present in today's languages are signs of language attrition, of incomplete language acquisition by the younger folks, that is indeed often claimed both by linguists and by some learned people in the communities, in particular teachers and pastors. I've heard on more than one occasion that people complained about outside researchers who can't speak the language, nonetheless have the goal to discredit native speakers' authenticity on phonological or morphosyntactic grounds. First of all, those so-called younger speakers are mostly in their 60s or older, and oftentimes the same people who criticize younger people's speech as corrupted actually belong to the same age group and make the same mergers outside of very deliberate pronunciation. However, this does not mean that that generation hasn't fully acquired their ancestral language. In my experience, the mergers are the norm among people who still have a more or less full set of teeth to enunciate, at least in Renaissance. But many of these people use the language on a daily basis as a default in their families and otherwise. Many of them use their ancestral language more than they use Mandarin, and based on my observation, clearly express themselves more deliberately in their ancestral language than in Mandarin. And some of these people speak so fluently that they put Spanish rappers to shame, I tell you. So rather than an incomplete language acquisition, I believe that the mergers are quite comparable to lazy pronunciation in Cantonese, if you're familiar with that. Insisting on maintaining the historical phonological distinction, to me, feels like not yet. To me, feels like insisting on the WH pronunciation of what, which in English. It's quite comparable to that, or the horse distinction, if you're at all familiar with that. And to make a further comparison to Taiwanese, one would not claim that people who don't pronounce the g before the labial glide, as in gua, right, who say wa, are only semi-speakers, or people who don't contrast the z and the le, right, as is very common in Taipei, in fact. But enough rambling. For the communities in question, we do have those alternative pronunciations. The question arises, what form of the language to represent in writing, in teaching materials, or any kind of publications, of which there's a growing number. There's, of course, not a straightforward or ideal solution to this, but I present here some advantages and disadvantages of each approach. I think they're pretty much straightforward. You can probably imagine what they are, so I won't go through them in detail, but I can show it again later on if we have more time. But I'll move on here in the interest of time, right? Okay, I'll just leave it for a couple of more seconds in case you want to skim over it real quick. Okay. Now, if you look at publications from different Atayalic varieties, you can see different stances towards orthography. Generally, Bibles preserve phonological distinctions. All varieties do so, including, for example, here in Split, you can see Atayalic here. But then, so this is a Bible. But then in another glossary of vocabulary here, you see that Symbolic often accepts the mergers in writing, but there are also Symbolic being spread over a huge area with a lot of different speech communities. There are also sources from elsewhere where they might have, tend more toward the conservative pronunciation. The Tagataya Siddiq tend to accept mergers also in spelling, more so than the other Siddiq varieties. So, for example, here you see on teaching materials, you see the traditional form, but in the dictionary of the same language, you see that the L has merged with N and is presented in such a way. Is there something else? Yeah, the mergers in things that were less carefully produced, like for example in street signs or so on, you see the mergers all over in different communities. So for example, the word for leashing is you can find as malepa or marepa. Okay, so in conclusion, there's a generation of fully fluent native speakers who, however, have a series of phonological mergers. Some of that phonological fluidity, especially the one between Q, K, glottal stop, and X and H may in fact be old rather than a new phenomenon under the influence of Chinese. Differences in published data of different dialects may not represent actual dialectal differences, but rather different orthographical stances toward language shift. All right, so this should be kept in mind when pulling data from published resources as opposed to doing personal fieldwork, because, like I said, the differences might appear bigger than they actually are. And so if you do lexical, what do you call it, distance studies or something, then this should be kept in mind, or if you do reconstruction. While data from the eldest community members are obviously precious, researchers shouldn't dismiss data from middle-aged speakers. And that concludes the talk. Thank you for your attention.